There is a question most people never think to ask until it is too late to do anything about the answer. Not, did I work hard enough? Not, did I save enough? The question is this: what did the generation before you leave behind? Because here is what nobody tells you when you are 35 and grinding and proud of your discipline. Your peace of mind in old age was probably decided before you were born, before your first job, before your first house, before your first grandchild sat on your lap. The foundation was poured decades before you arrived. And right now, somewhere in this country, a 68-year-old man is standing at a funeral home counter handing over a Visa card with a $9,400 limit to pay for his mother's burial. She didn't leave a policy. She didn't leave a will. She left a rented apartment, $2,200 in a checking account, and 4 boxes of personal items that nobody could agree on who should keep. That man is not unusual. That man is the majority. And sitting in the same country on the same Tuesday afternoon, an attorney in a glass office is filing the paperwork to fund an irrevocable dynasty trust for an unborn grandchild. The money going into that trust will not be taxed when the child inherits it. It will not be taxed when that child's children inherit it. It will compound, protected, shielded from estate taxes for potentially 100 years for a person who does not yet exist. That is the distance this conversation is going to cover. And if you are over 60, if you have started thinking about what comes after you, stay with this, because what happens next matters more than anything you've done with money so far. Level 1. Inheriting debt. Your parents worked. They worked hard. That is not in question. Factory shifts, double shifts, night shifts. They never complained. They were not the type. But they also never talked about money. Not at dinner. Not in private. Not with an attorney. Not with a financial planner. Not with anybody. Because in their world, money was something you managed. Not something you planned. Not something you passed down. Planning was for rich people. And they were not rich people. So when they died, you found out the way most people find out. You found out at the bank. The balance was $3,700. The credit card had $11,400 on it. The car had $4,200 left on the loan. The medical bills from the last 6 months, those came in the mail over the following 8 weeks, one envelope at a time. You paid for the funeral on a credit card because there was no other way. The average funeral in America right now costs between $8,000 and $13,000 when you include the burial plot, the headstone, and the basic services. If you added any flowers, any catering, any extra time at the facility, you were closer to $15,000. You put $9,400 on your Visa and split the rest with your sister. And then you sat in your parents' house the night after the funeral, and you did something your parents never did. You started counting, not grieving, counting what is left, what is owed, what can be sold, what cannot. And the number at the end of that count was less than 0. At level 1, the inheritance is negative. You didn't receive a foundation. You received the bill for the foundation that was never built. And here is the thing that will keep you awake long after the grief passes. What are you going to leave? Level 2, inheriting nothing. This level is quieter than the first, and in some ways, harder to sit with. At level 1, there is chaos. There are bills. There is something to process. At level 2, there is silence. Your parents died and left you. Nothing. Not debt. Not assets. Just the objects in a house that smelled like them and some boxes you couldn't bring yourself to open for 3 months. They had Social Security, they spent it. They had a small pension. It covered their rent and their groceries and their prescriptions and not much else. They owned nothing. They invested nothing. They planned nothing, because there was nothing left over at the end of each month to plan with. This is not a story about failure. This is a story about mathematics. According to Federal Reserve data, the bottom half of American households by wealth holds only about 2.5% of total U.S. wealth, not 25%, not 10%, 2.5%. That means roughly 130 million Americans are sharing a fraction of this country's accumulated resources. When those Americans die, there is nothing to transfer. And their children, who are now in their 60s, they are in the same position their parents were in. Not behind, not struggling, just starting from zero. Again. The invisible cost of level 2 is not the money you didn't receive. It is the time you lost. The decade you spent in a lower quality neighborhood because you couldn't access a down payment. The job you didn't take because you couldn't afford to relocate. The opportunity that passed because there was no cushion, no margin, no safety net underneath you when you needed to take a risk. Every one of those lost decades compounds, not against you, against your children. Level 3, the first house, the first attempt. Something changes at this level, and it feels significant because it is. Your parents owned a house, not a grand house, a 1,400 square foot house in a working neighborhood with a small yard and a driveway that flooded every February. But it was theirs, paid off or nearly paid off by the time they passed. When they died, you received your portion of the sale, maybe $120,000, maybe $80,000, maybe $60,000, depending on the market, the condition of the home, what siblings were in the picture, and whether there were any liens. For most people at this level, that money is the largest single amount they have ever received. And here is where the decision happens. Here is where the next generation's trajectory is decided. Some people at this level spend it, not recklessly, practically, a new car, some credit card debt they've been carrying for years, a renovation on their own home. Some help for a struggling adult child. The money dissolves in less than 2 years, not into luxury, into relief. Others invest it, put it in an index fund, add it to a 401k, use it as a down payment on a rental property, let it sit and grow. And the distance between those two choices, measured in 20 years, is the difference between giving your grandchildren a story to tell and giving them a foundation to stand on. At this level, you are holding the first real tool your family has ever had. The question is whether you understand what it is. Level 4, the middle class inheritance. You received somewhere between $200,000 and $500,000. Not from one source necessarily, from the house, from a life insurance policy your parents had the discipline to keep paying, from a small IRA they opened in the 80s and never touched. This amount is real. This amount changes things. If you were 60 when you received it and you invested it conservatively, you could expect it to generate somewhere between $8,000 and $20,000 a year in income for the rest of your life. Not a fortune, but a margin. The margin between a difficult retirement and a manageable one. The margin between telling your kids yes and telling your kids no. The margin between dying with something left over and dying with the account at zero on the last day. But here is what happens at level 4 that most people don't see coming. The money makes you visible in a new way. The calls from family members increase. The cousin who needs a loan to start a business. The child who is behind on their mortgage. The sibling who is struggling with medical debt and just needs a bridge, just this once. And you have to make a decision that nobody prepared you for. Because here is the tension at level 4 that nobody talks about at Thanksgiving dinner. The money you have right now is not your money. Not entirely. It belongs to the version of you at 75, at 80, at 85. The version of you who will need long-term care that costs an average of $95,000 per year in a private nursing facility. The version of you whose Medicare doesn't cover what you thought it covered. The version of you who will need prescription drugs and specialists and possibly home health aides for years. If you give this money away, that version of you has nothing. And nobody in this conversation is going to tell you what to choose, but you should understand what you're choosing between. Level 5, the comfortable generation. Your parents did something specific, something deliberate. They sat down with an estate attorney. They created a revocable living trust. They named their beneficiaries clearly. They had a will that was updated and signed and notarized. They had powers of attorney in place. They had a healthcare directive. When they died, there was no probate. The assets transferred directly, no court, no delays, no months of family arguments over who gets what. You received your inheritance cleanly, maybe $600,000, maybe $800,000, maybe a little more. And because your parents' plan was structured correctly, you received it without a legal fight, without losing 3% of the estate to probate fees, without the confusion and grief that poisons so many families at this exact moment. At level 5, you received more than money. You received proof that planning works. And something important happens to people who receive that proof. They repeat the behavior. They call an attorney. They set up their own trust. They name their own beneficiaries. They think about what they are building and for whom. According to data from the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, the receipt of a substantial inheritance is one of the strongest predictors of whether a household will accumulate wealth themselves. Not because the money does all the work, because the inheritance changes something in the psychology of the recipient. You begin to think in generations, not just in years, not just in your own lifetime, in generations. That shift is worth more than the money itself. Level 6, the first trust. Something happens at this level that is invisible to most people. The money doesn't transfer when someone dies. It transfers when it's supposed to transfer, according to terms, according to conditions, according to the plan that was written years before anyone died. A revocable trust becomes irrevocable at death. Assets inside it go directly to the named beneficiaries, without touching the probate process, without being subject to the public record that probate creates. But at level 6, we are talking about something more than avoiding probate. We are talking about planning that spans decades. Your parents or grandparents set up a trust that was designed to protect assets from unnecessary taxation. That used the federal gift tax exemption, which as of 2026 is $15 million per person, $30 million per couple, to transfer wealth during their lifetime in a tax-advantaged way. That trust was funded, invested, managed by a trustee who understood its purpose. And when you received your distribution, you received it without the 40% federal estate tax eating the top of it. At this level, the family didn't just save money. The family saved the strategy. And the strategy is more durable than any single amount. Because a strategy can be repeated, a lump sum can only be spent. The question that hangs in the air at level 6, is your family building a strategy or just accumulating numbers? Level 7, the quiet network. At this level, money has stopped being a conversation anyone has directly. It exists in documents, in trusts, in accounts managed by people whose job is to protect what has already been built. Your grandchildren, when they are born, may already have accounts in their names. Not because you sat down and wrote a check the day they arrived, because the plan was already running before they arrived. Certain states allow dynasty trusts to exist in perpetuity, meaning the trust doesn't end at death, meaning the assets inside continue to grow. Protected, managed, distributed, according to terms set by someone who may have died a generation ago. The Rockefeller family is often cited in these conversations, not because they are exceptional, but because they are visible. John D. Rockefeller died in 1937. His family's wealth is still institutionally managed, still structured, still producing income for descendants who never met the man who built it. That is not magic. That is the compound effect of planning that was taken seriously at every generation. At level 7, the family is not wealthy because of one person's exceptional work. The family is wealthy because of a system that survived the people who built it. But here is what doesn't get mentioned. At this level, the family dinner table has a different kind of tension. Not financial tension, relational tension. Who manages the trust? Who gets distributions? What happens when one child is responsible and another is not? What happens when someone marries someone the family doesn't trust? Money, at this level, doesn't solve family problems. It makes them permanent. Level 8. The family office and the foundation. The threshold for a single family office is typically cited at $100 million or more in investable assets. Below that number, the cost of maintaining a private investment and administrative infrastructure rarely makes economic sense. At $100 million and above, the architecture changes entirely. You don't have a financial advisor. You have a team, a chief investment officer, a tax attorney, an estate planner, a compliance officer, an administrator who coordinates the movement of money between entities that exist in multiple states, possibly multiple countries. Your family's assets are not sitting in a brokerage account. They are deployed across private equity, real estate holdings, municipal bonds, venture positions, and cash reserves that are managed according to a written investment policy statement. And alongside the family office, the foundation. Here is the part that doesn't get mentioned in the glossy profiles. A private charitable foundation can serve a genuine philanthropic purpose. Many do. Many are operated by families who care deeply about the causes they support. But a foundation also has specific legal advantages. Assets transferred into a private foundation are removed from the taxable estate. The family retains control over how those assets are deployed. Grants are made over time at the family's discretion to qualifying organizations. And the family name goes on the building, the hospital wing, the university chair, the arts center, not as vanity, as permanence. Because at level 8, the goal is not comfort. The goal is continuity. Not just of the money, of the name. And this is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable. Because when you trace the families who operate at this level, you find that they didn't build this in one generation. It took 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 5. Someone worked, their children preserved, their grandchildren structured, their great-grandchildren institutionalized. Each generation did one thing. They did not let it end with them. Now step back from the numbers, step back from the levels, and look at what this conversation is actually about. It is about the weight of what comes before you and after you. Right now, between 70 and 80% of American households will never receive a meaningful inheritance. Not a small one, not a large one, nothing. That is not because their parents didn't love them. It is because their parents never had a conversation, never wrote a will, never called an attorney, never thought of their death as an event that required preparation. And so their children, now in their 60s, are doing what their parents did, working hard, managing, surviving, without a foundation, without a structure, without a document that says what happens when you are gone. And somewhere in this country, there are people who will transfer $30 trillion over the next 20 years. $30 trillion. Most of it going to people who are already wealthy. Most of it structured to avoid taxes that were designed to prevent dynasties from forming. That is not an accusation. That is a description of how the system operates when you know how to use it. The people in the upper levels of this conversation didn't get there by working harder. They got there because someone before them understood that money, left unplanned, evaporates, and money, properly structured, multiplies. There is a moment at most family Thanksgiving dinners in America that is never named out loud. It happens in the kitchen, when the older relatives are talking and someone mentions the house, or the account, or what happens when, and the younger relatives go quiet. Not because they're listening, because they're calculating what comes to me, what doesn't, who gets what. And the answer to that calculation was probably decided years ago, maybe by a document that exists, maybe by the absence of one. Here is the only question that matters. Not what did your parents leave you, not what did your grandparents build. The question is this: when your grandchildren are sitting around a table decades from now, are they calculating what you left them? Or are they sitting on top of something you built before they were born? If this conversation reached somewhere quiet inside you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button. And if you want to keep going down this road with us, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We put out work like this every week, no noise. Just what's real.